I'm Al Letson, and you are listening to Reveal. When it comes to the CIA's use of enhanced interrogation, there's still a lot of unfinished business. Just this past December, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a report that stirred up a lot of conversation in the public and in Congress.
The CIA's actions a decade ago are a stain on our value and on our history. The release of this 500-page summary cannot remove that stain.
This particular release, in my judgment, serves no purpose whatsoever other than to endanger Americans around the world.
Here's the thing. It wasn't just the CIA. The U.S. military also used similar techniques in Afghanistan and Iraq. And come on, let's be real here. When I say techniques, what we are really talking about is torture. We know a lot more about torture, not just because of the Senate report, but from a host of whistleblowers, including Alberto Mora. He was the Navy's top lawyer during the Bush administration.
If we're to say that we're a country that uses torture and uses cruelty, then we're not the country we were founded as, and we're not the country we're meant to be.
We'll get back to my conversation with Mora later. But first, a story about the Iraq War and the impact of torture on the men who took part in the abuse. Reporter Joshua Phillips spent years investigating a group of Army soldiers who came home deeply troubled by some of the things they did to Iraqi prisoners. Phillips was drawn to one man in particular, a combat medic with lots of secrets. Here's Josh.
Before you continue, just spell your name for me so I have it.
It's Jonathan. Last name is Millantz, Millantz.
The first time I spoke with Jonathan Millantz was this phone call in 2006. The war in Iraq had been going on for 3 years, and John was a combat medic there during some of the worst fighting. But now he was back home on a medical discharge.
Let's see here. I don't care if you use my name, but I'm not going to release any information about anybody else's name or anything like that.
Okay.
He was offering to help me report on soldiers who had tried but failed to blow the whistle on abuses by U.S. troops in Iraq. John told me violent interrogations, cruelty, and torture weren't limited to the CIA or at Abu Ghraib prison. He described a remote place in Iraq that the public didn't know about, a small army base where captured Iraqis were beaten, kept sleepless, and chained to bars for days.
My job was actually to check their vital signs and make sure that we're not killing them.
I wanted to know more, but it was tough to get details. John would reach out to me, then disappear for months. When I caught him on the phone, he could be evasive. He finally agreed to sit down for an interview at his mother's house in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. John told me about his deployment to the Sunni Triangle, the turbulent region north of Baghdad. He was attached to a tank battalion, part of the 4th Infantry Division. But with American troops being targeted and killed by the insurgents, the men left their tanks and fought a different kind of war. They raided homes, hauling captured Iraqi men back to a forward operating base.
There was already a jail there, sliding doors and all that good stuff. I don't know if it was something from Saddam's regime that he had put there or whatever, but there was about 6 cells on each side.
Next to the jail were the interrogation booths. John told me detainees were beaten and tormented there before and during questioning. Sometimes troops abused prisoners out of anger and frustration with the war.
Some of the guys in the jail, I remember some of the Iraqi stories, they're like, why am I even here? I got arrested. I'm just a farmer trying to make a living, and they're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I can only imagine getting interrogated for so long, for weeks, and they're just thinking, what the hell? I mean, I didn't even do anything. I can't even know. I'm sure some of these guys are probably even making up stuff to say because they really didn't know.
The majority of people that we captured and tortured were completely innocent. That seems to keep getting lost in the defense of these techniques that were used and things like that.
Eli Wright met John in basic training. He's one of about a dozen soldiers I've interviewed who've served alongside John or at a nearby base and who witnessed prisoner abuse. Like John, Wright was a combat medic who treated Iraqi men after brutal interrogations.
As a medic, I guess I enlisted with some pretty high ideals. So to be put in a situation where I was involved in, being party to hurting others, which is of course what happens in war, but to do it in the way that we were doing it in those holding cells, it really shattered my worldview.
John also seemed shattered by powerful feelings of guilt.
It's been really hard over the years coming to terms with what actually happened over there. And,
I remember this moment in one of our interviews. John is sitting uneasily in a hotel room. As he struggles for words, his fingers slowly tear apart a styrofoam coffee cup.
Just, feeling comfortable even talking about it with myself or another veteran or someone who's there. Because from my point of view, keeping a person alive while these so-called interrogation techniques are going on, it definitely burns an image to your brain that you'll never forget.
One day, John handed me a snapshot. In the photo, John is posing with an army lieutenant in the jail back in Iraq where they questioned detainees. Standing in the foreground is an Iraqi man wincing in pain. John shared this picture to prove abuse and torture really happened and that officers were present and oversaw it. But the photo reveals something else. Both men standing next to the prisoner are smiling. John's smile is a little goofy, but he also seems to be raising his fist over the man's head. Turns out, John wasn't just treating prisoners at the jail, he also took part in the abuse. Recently, I showed John's photo to his friend Eli Wright. It was the first time he had seen the image. You can see in the picture, if you look closely enough, that the detainee is sweating through.
Oh, he's completely covered in sweat, yeah. He's soaked through. You can barely see any dry spots on his clothing.
The Iraqi prisoner is holding a heavy wooden board in his hands. John had told me the prisoner was forced to hold the board so long that his wrist broke.
It's really hard to see him in that photo because that's not the Johnny I knew, and that's not the way that he was before he went to war, for sure. Like many of us, it brought out a dark side that we all have within us and allowed it to run completely free with no restraint. For me, seeing this officer standing there, that's where it feels like a major betrayal, that we were led into this by people who gave a green light to just go ahead with whatever crazy stuff they would invent and come up with. Obviously speaks to, again, one of those disconnects that often is portrayed on these incidents, that these are, young bad apple soldiers.
When I asked John about his role in the abuse, he told me this.
I think any human being in that sort of situation would have done the same thing.
But he also told me he tried to speak out about the abuses in the jail.
So I'm not going to say any names, but I voiced my opinion many times to officers in the units and NCOs. It was beat into our brains the entire time we were there. This is a company-level operation. Do not talk about it. Do not tell anybody about this, because they knew exactly what the hell they were doing.
Another one of John's friends, Michael Blake, says John told him about trying to report the abuse to his superiors. Blake also served in the 4th Infantry Division and was stationed nearby.
He said they tried to take it to the first-line supervisor, the platoon sergeant, went all the way up to the CO, and nobody would listen to him or do anything about it.
It's not easy to be a whistleblower in the U.S. military.
John Sifton of Human Rights Watch has widely investigated brutal interrogations and detainee abuse by the U.S. military. He says John Malance's story is one piece in a broad pattern of U.S. torture and how American forces got away with it.
In Iraq and Afghanistan, most people who were investigated got off with a slap on the wrist or nothing.
John Malance and his friends would often make that point to me. Low-ranking soldiers have taken most of the blame.
The most egregious thing is not so much that the soldiers were not held accountable, but that the accountability didn't go up the chain of command to the people who made the decisions that led to the abuse in the first place.
After he returned from Iraq, John was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. He was open with me about that. And like other members of his unit, he was dealing with substance abuse, prescription, and street drugs. He was also haunted by a member of his unit who attempted suicide and then died of a drug overdose. That soldier had told his friends and family that he was troubled by the prisoner abuse and torture.
Hello? John.
Yeah.
How are you, man? It's Josh calling.
For a time, it looked like John was coping.
Rehab for about 3 months.
He was living at home, getting counseling, and had a new girlfriend.
I consider myself very fortunate. I had friends commit suicide when I got back. I know people who had to have guns pulled out of their mouth. I know people who can't get out of bed every day without being on 15 different types of medication at the VA.
He also found a way to channel his anger and frustration about Iraq. He joined the anti-war movement.
I was in a big protest in Manhattan. There was about 60,000 people behind us, and I was leading the march, and a guy from American Legion came up and called me a traitor. And I guess I can understand where he's coming from, but he didn't see the same thing I saw.
But drugs caught up with him. Days after one of our interviews, John almost died from an overdose of Xanax. I didn't know it at the time. His sister Rosalind says he was in anguish when she saw him in the hospital.
He would mumble things to me when he was in and out of consciousness in the hospital after taking numerous pills. He would mumble things to me like, I tried so hard, Rosalind, to fix what I did. And I'd be like, Jonathan, what are you talking about? And he'd be like, the tortures, the jails.
John's friends wondered if it was a suicide attempt. No one knew for sure.
Hey, Josh, what's up? This is Johnny. I'm doing really good, really good. Just got back from a counseling group. Give me a call at my house whenever you want to. I'd like to talk to you. Okay? Bye.
This message was one of the last times I heard from John. Looking back, I never fully knew the depths of his depression, but John's sister Rosalind saw it close up.
He just felt alone and isolated and felt that he didn't deserve help. He thought he needed to be put to death in one way or another for his actions over in Iraq.
Jonathan Malance died at his home in Greensburg 3 years after our first phone call. The coroner found it was acute combined drug toxicity from a mix of prescription drugs. On a recent blustery winter evening, I visited John's friend, Eli Wright, at an art studio in Branchburg, New Jersey. He's been working with a veterans art collective called the Combat Paper Project. They beat military uniforms into pulp for handmade paper.
So what are you doing here?
Just emptying out the beater, putting the pulp into a bucket, and then from here it's gonna go into the vat where I pull the sheets from. Well, I think he has an important story to tell, and he's not here to tell it anymore, and so it's up to the few of us left that he had an impact on to keep him alive through telling his story.
Wright is crafting the paper into 3 masks. One represents himself, another the prisoners he encountered in Iraq. The third mask is John.
It's not intended to be a literal representation or portrait of just Johnny himself. It's representative of a broader range of people who have seen things and experienced things that they weren't able to reconcile.
In 2 of the masks, the faces are blindfolded. For John's, the eyes are wide open.
Often there's things that we wish we could unsee, and I've got sort of an idea in mind of sewing his eyes open so that he's unable to look away. He's unable to unsee the things that were in front of him.
Wright stares at the mask. He reflects on the damage that torture inflicted on his friend and on him. It's a legacy that Wright still reckons with today. It's one that he can't unsee either.
Joshua Phillips has tried many times over the past 8 years to get the military to respond to soldiers' accounts of torture, allegations that officers knew what was going on, and they stifled complaints from men like John Malance, but they came back with nothing. So this January, we tried again, and just before broadcast, we heard back. The Army told us there's no record of any investigation into the alleged abuse. They say the information we provided, including the soldiers' testimonies and that photo, the actual photograph of the officer with the Iraqi prisoner, all that wasn't enough. To search their database for complaints of abuse, the Army would need the detainee's name or military-issued serial number. Of course, the problem with that is that we don't have those details. You see, that's the exact type of information the military is charged with finding. You can see the photo from this story on our website, revealnews.org. And now we're going to dig just a little bit deeper on the U.S.'s use of torture with Alberto Mora. He was the general counsel of the Navy during the Bush administration. Now, he opposed the White House's interrogation policies and tried to change them. And today, he co-directs the Cost and Consequences of Torture program at Harvard University. Alberto Mora, thank you so much for joining us.
Most welcome.
So I wanted to ask you about the Senate Intelligence Committee report on the CIA interrogation program that was released in December. The accounts of cruelty by U.S. personnel were pretty graphic. Was any of that information new to you?
In general terms, it was not, but I think there were, in specific terms, there was a lot that was new. The level of cruelty was much higher than I had previously understood, and I think higher than most of the American people understood. And I think one effect of that is that no reasonable person can call the program of enhanced interrogations by that euphemism any longer. I think what we can all recognize it as being is a program of torture and cruelty, but torture was certainly inflicted.
You challenged the Bush administration on its treatment of detainees while you were the Navy's top lawyer. Let's hear a little bit of that testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee back in 2008.
Mr. Chairman, our nation's policy decision to use so-called harsh interrogation techniques during the war on terror was a mistake of massive proportions. It damaged and continues to damage our nation. This policy violated our founding values, our constitutional system and the fabric of our laws, our overarching foreign policy interests, and our national security.
I want to ask you, what was it like to take on the Bush administration?
Actually, that's not the way I saw it. I was very much a part of the Bush administration. I felt I saw more clearly than perhaps others what the law required and what our policy interests in this area should have dictated. And I was active in the internal debate to protect the Navy. Certainly that was my job, but protect also the Department of Defense and protect our president from the consequences of a poorly chosen policy. Also, I was never alone in this. I always felt supported by the Navy and Marine Corps, felt supported by all the military lawyers in the Pentagon, and felt supported by the senior military officials and civilian officials that I spoke with.
When you think about like raw numbers, the military actually ended up using these enhanced interrogation or torture, whatever we're labeling it as. They actually used it more than the CIA.
Well, I think, first of all, the observation is a correct one. And what that points to is the fact that often decisions are different from implementation in varying degrees, and that the policymaking process is messy. To a man and woman, the senior military leaders in the Pentagon understood that the use of cruelty is not something that we did or would want to do as a nation. Clearly, the nation also sent out a signal from the White House on down to many others that the use of cruelty was effective and perhaps necessary to save us from further loss of life. And as it got transmitted down into the field, that message was also taken on board, and it encouraged acts of brutality and the use of brutality in the interrogation of detainees in the military system. The end result of that was, as you described, that the actual numbers of abuse were greater on the military side than on the CIA side.
You know, literally, like we're talking about a practice here that we morally look at as wrong, but yet there's no consequences for it. So therefore, it's kind of a ripe field for it to happen again.
You're exactly right. And this is a dilemma that the nation faces. We have effectively immunized the use of torture as we did in the Bush administration because the facts are exactly as you described them. We have not held anybody accountable for the commission of torture. Now, it's no good to have a law in the books if you don't enforce it. And it's no good to say that torture is reprehensible and constitutes a crime if no one's going to be prosecuted for the commission of a crime.
Who would you hold accountable for the actions that have happened?
I am not sure how to answer that question. I'm not sure because while it is, as a matter of conventional black-letter legal analysis, everyone who applied the torture and who authorized or facilitated its application is to be held accountable under U.S. law and international law for doing that. So in this case, President Bush himself has indicated that he authorized the use of these enhanced interrogation techniques that we know to be torture. And Vice President Cheney and others, the Attorney General and many on the Department of Justice legal team that provided counsel consciously authorized these techniques and falsely or tendentiously claimed that what is torture and what has always been torture was not torture under American law. The end result is clear to see, but how this all shakes out is unclear from an accountability standpoint. So while it's unthinkable legally that people not be held accountable, by the same token, from a political standpoint, it's equally unthinkable that people be held accountable, particularly the former president.
Alberto Mora, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Our story about U.S. torture policies was produced by Michael Montgomery.